the echoing pines. There's something about Pine Hollow that draws people in. It's not the beauty of the trees or the serenity of the forest. It's something deeper, something that calls to the darkest parts of your mind. I moved to the small town near Pine Hollow after my wife Claire passed away. I needed a place to escape, somewhere quiet where I could be alone with my thoughts. The townsfolk warned me to stay away from the forest, but I didn't listen. I didn't believe in their stories of people who went in and never came back. I thought it was just a local legend, a way to keep outsiders away. For the first few weeks, I stuck to the outskirts, hiking the well-worn trails during the day. The forest was peaceful, a sanctuary from my grief. But the more I walked those paths, the more I felt it. The pull of the deeper woods, parts untouched by time. It was like a whisper in the back of my mind, constant, nagging feeling that there was something more out there, something I needed to find. I became obsessed. My dreams were filled with images of twisted trees and shadowed paths, something just out of sight waiting for me. It started to consume me. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. All I could think about was the forest, the secrets it held, and the feeling that whatever was out there was calling to me. One day, I couldn't resist anymore. I packed a bag, took a compass, and set off into the woods. I told myself it was just another hike. I'd turn back before it got dark. But deep down, I knew I wasn't coming back. Not until I found whatever it was that haunted my dreams. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed. Air grew heavy, the light dimmed, and the trees closed in around me. The compass became useless, the needle spinning wildly, and the trail disappeared beneath a carpet of pine needles. But I didn't care. I kept going, driven by something I couldn't explain. Hours passed, or maybe days. It was impossible to tell. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in on me, as if it was alive, breathing, watching. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. But every so often, I would hear it, an echo, a voice that wasn't my own, whispering my name. I tried to shake it off as a trick of the wind, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of things I'd buried deep inside, my guilt, my regrets, the pain of losing Claire. They knew things about me that no one else could, things I didn't even admit to myself. And the more I listened, the more I realized that the voice wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within. I began to see things, glimpses of Claire, her face twisted in agony, calling out to me. Shadows moved in the corner of my vision, and the trees seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I knew I was losing my mind, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going, had to find whatever it was that called to me. Finally, I reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive, ancient pine, bark blackened and twisted, as if it had been struck by lightning. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, telling me to come closer, touch the tree. I stepped forward, my hand outstretched, and as soon as my fingers brushed the bark, everything went silent. Forest, the whispers, even my own thoughts, all of it was swallowed by an overwhelming darkness. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if the tree was draining the life out of me, pulling me into its twisted roots. And then, in the darkness, I saw her, Claire, standing just beyond the tree, her eyes hollow, face gaunt. She reached out to me, her lips forming words I couldn't hear. But I knew what she wanted. She wanted me to join her, to be with her again. I took a step forward, but something held me back. Part of me, buried deep beneath the obsession and the madness, fought against it. This wasn't Claire. It was something else, something that had taken her form, feeding on my guilt and grief. I tried to pull away, but the tree wouldn't let go. The roots wrapped around my legs, the bark pressing against my skin, and I felt it, the hunger, the need to consume, to devour my very soul. I screamed, sound ripping through the silence, and for a brief moment I broke free. I ran, not knowing where I was going, only that I had to get away. Forest blurred around me, the shadows chasing me, the whispers now angry, furious that I had escaped. I don't know how I made it out. One moment I was running through the darkness, and the next, I was at the edge of the forest, the sun rising over the horizon. But something wasn't right. The town looked different, older, decayed. People who found me were strangers, their clothes worn and their faces haggard. They told me I'd been missing for years, that I was the last of many who had gone into Pine Hollow and never returned. But I knew the truth. I hadn't escaped. Not really. The forest still has a hold on me, its roots deep in my mind. I can feel it, even now. The whispers are still there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to pull me back. I can't sleep, can't think, can't escape the feeling that I'm still in that forest, still lost among the trees. And one day, I know I'll go back. I'll return to Pine Hollow, to that ancient tree, and this time I won't be able to resist. Because the forest doesn't just want you to visit, it wants you to stay. Forever. The Whispering Pines. In the small, forgotten village of Pine Hollow, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, life moved at a slow, steady pace. The village was surrounded by dense, ancient woods known as the Whispering Pines, a place that the locals spoke of only in hushed tones. The trees were tall, their branches twisted, as if the forest itself were alive and watching. It was said that the forest whispered secrets, drawing in those who dared to listen too closely. Jacob, a 16-year-old boy with a curious mind and a love for the outdoors, always been fascinated by the Whispering Pines. His mother often warned him to stay away from the deeper parts of the forest, where the trees grew thick and the light barely penetrated. But Jacob couldn't resist the pull of the unknown. He would spend hours wandering the edges of the forest, his imagination running wild as he imagined what lay beyond. One crisp autumn morning, the village was shaken by a horrific discovery. The lifeless body of Emily, a 17-year-old girl from the village, was found hanging from a tree deep within the Whispering Pines. The sight of her pale, still form swaying in the cold breeze sent a shiver through the hearts of everyone who saw it. The villagers were quick to label it a suicide, tragic end to a troubled girl. But Jacob knew better. Emily had been full of life, always smiling, her laughter echoing through the village. The thought that she would take her own life didn't sit right with him. As the days passed, Jacob found himself unable to shake the image of Emily's lifeless body. It haunted his dreams, her vacant eyes staring back at him, pleading for help. He couldn't understand why, but he felt a deep connection to her, a need to uncover the truth. Forest, once a place of wonder, now felt sinister, as if it held a dark secret, just waiting to be discovered. Against his mother's warnings, Jacob began to venture deeper into the Whispering Pines. The further he went, the more the forest seemed to close in around him, the trees whispering his name in a language he couldn't understand. He spent hours searching, looking for anything that might explain what had happened to Emily. But the forest was a maze, and no matter how far he walked, he always ended up back where he started. His obsession grew, consuming him. He could no longer focus on anything else. All he could think about was Emily and the dark, twisted trees that had taken her life. The villagers began to notice his strange behavior, whispering that the forest had claimed another soul, that Jacob was losing his mind. But he didn't care. He knew that he had to find the truth, no matter the cost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest was bathed in an eerie twilight, Jacob stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. There, hidden among the roots of an ancient tree, was a small, leather-bound journal. He recognized it immediately. It was Emily's. His hands trembled as he opened the journal, flipping through the pages filled with her neat, looping handwriting. But as he read, his heart sank. The journal was filled with entries about the forest, about how Emily had felt it calling to her, how she couldn't escape its pull. She wrote about the whispers, about how they had started out soft, almost comforting, but had grown louder, more insistent, until they were all she could hear. She wrote about a man, a shadowy figure who appeared in her dreams, his voice smooth and comforting, urging her to come deeper into the woods. But the final entry was what truly terrified Jacob. Emily had written that she had seen the man in the village, that he was someone she knew, someone everyone knew. She didn't name him, but the fear in her words was palpable. She wrote that she was going to confront him, to demand answers, but she never got the chance. Jacob's mind raced as he tried to piece together what he had just read. The man in Emily's dreams wasn't just a figment of her imagination. He was real, and he was in the village. But who was he? And why had he led Emily to her death? As Jacob turned to leave the forest, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. The forest was silent, the whispers gone, but the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Jacob returned to the village, the journal clutched tightly in his hand. He knew he had to find the man Emily had written about, to confront him and make him pay for what he had done. But as he walked through the village, he noticed something strange. The villagers were watching him, their eyes cold and distant, as if they knew something he didn't. That night, as he lay in bed, Jacob couldn't sleep. The journal sat on his bedside table, its presence a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the village. He tried to push the thoughts from his mind, but the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing in his ears. "Jacob?" The voice was soft, almost soothing, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He knew that voice. It was the same voice Emily had written about in her journal. Voice of the man who had led her to her death. With a growing sense of dread, Jacob got out of bed and made his way to the window. The village was dark, the only light coming from the full moon that hung high in the sky. But as he looked out, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was a figure. Tall and thin, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. The man smiled, cold, cruel smile that sent a wave of terror through Jacob's body. "You're next," the man whispered, voice carrying on the wind. Jacob stumbled back, his heart racing. He knew then that he couldn't stay in the village, that he had to leave before it was too late. But as he turned to grab the journal, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice. Written across the pages in Emily's handwriting were the words, "He's one of them. Run." Jacob's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. The villagers, they were all part of it, part of the forest, part of whatever dark force had claimed Emily's life. And now they were coming for it. In a blind panic, Jacob grabbed the journal and fled from his house, running through the dark, empty streets of the village. The whispers grew louder, filling his ears, drowning out his thoughts. Run! He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs could carry him no further. But no matter how far he went, whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. Finally, he reached the edge of the forest, the trees towering over him like ancient sentinels. He knew he shouldn't go in. The forest was dangerous, but he had no choice. The village was no longer safe. As he stepped into the forest, the whispers grew quiet, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. Trees seemed to close in around him, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers. But he kept going, driven by a need to escape, to survive. But the further he went, the more he realized the truth. There was no escape. Forest had claimed Emily, and now it was claiming him. The villagers, the man in the shadows, they were all part of it, part of the dark force that lived within the trees. And as Jacob stood there, alone in the darkness, he finally understood the true horror of the Whispering Pine. It wasn't just a forest, it was alive, feeding on the fear and despair of those who wandered too deep. The last thing Jacob heard before the darkness swallowed him was a soft, almost comforting whisper. "Welcome home." And then, it's nothing. The Hollow Men. Deep in the heart of America's rural Midwest lies the small, unassuming village of Stillwater. The village had always been peaceful, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. The townsfolk knew each other by name, and everyone shared a sense of community, bond forged by years of quiet living. The only shadow in their lives was the vast, looming forest that bordered the village. The locals called it Blackwood, a place shrouded in superstition and dread. No one dared to venture too far into Blackwood, for the stories of those who had disappeared within its depths were enough to keep even the bravest souls away. One summer evening, a family of 3 arrived in Stillwater. They introduced themselves as the Harpers: John, the father, Mary, the mother, and their teenage son, Peter. The Harpers were an odd trio, their arrival stirring whispers among the villagers. They moved into an old, dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts, right on the edge of Blackwood. The house had been abandoned for years, and its new occupants did little to improve its condition. Instead, they seemed content to live in its decaying walls, isolated from the rest of the village. John was a tall, imposing man with a cold demeanor. He rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his words were clipped and emotionless. Mary, on the other hand, was eerily cheerful, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. She often wandered through the village, humming old tunes under her breath, her presence unsettling to those who crossed her path. Peter was a quiet boy, always lurking in the background, his dark eyes observing everything with a disconcerting intensity. Strange things began to happen soon after the Harpers settled in. Livestock went missing, leaving no trace but disturbed earth and broken fences. The village's crops, usually abundant, began to wither and die without explanation. At night, the villagers reported hearing strange noises coming from Blackwood. The sound of distant chanting, the rustle of leaves when there was no wind, and the occasional, faint glow of firelight deep within the trees. As the weeks passed, the villagers grew increasingly uneasy. Children spoke of seeing shadowy figures at the edge of the forest, watching them with hollow eyes. The local preacher, Father Harris, warned the villagers to stay away from the Harpers, claiming they were harbingers of something evil. His warnings were dismissed at first. The unease in Stillwater continued to grow. One night, a young girl named Emily went missing. She had been playing near the forest, and when she didn't return home, her frantic parents organized a search party. The entire village joined in, scouring the woods and the surrounding fields, but Emily was nowhere to be found. The villagers were on edge, their fear palpable. Whispers spread that the Harpers had something to do with her disappearance. Father Harris decided to confront the Harpers. Armed with a sense of righteous fury, he marched to their farmhouse, villagers following at a distance. John answered the door, his expression impassive as the preacher accused him of dark deeds and demanded to know where Emily was. John's response was chilling. "The forest takes what it's owed," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We have nothing to do with it." Father Harris refused to back down. He insisted on searching the house, but John stood firm, his cold eyes daring the preacher to challenge him. The standoff continued until Mary appeared, placing a hand on John's arm. "Let them search," she said softly, her smile unsettling in its calmness. "They won't find anything." The villagers searched the farmhouse from top to bottom, but as Mary had said, there was no sign of Emily. The Harpers watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. The villagers left the house with their fear now mixed with confusion and doubt. The uneasy feeling in Stillwater only deepened. The night after the search, Father Harris disappeared. His house was found empty, the door wide open, and his Bible lying on the floor, pages torn and scattered. Panic gripped the village. The once tight-knit community began to unravel, suspicion and fear driving a wedge between neighbors. As more villagers vanished, always without a trace, the remaining townsfolk became desperate. They accused one another of harboring dark secrets, being in league with whatever evil had befallen their village. The Harpers, meanwhile, continued to live quietly on the edge of Blackwood, seemingly unaffected by the chaos around them. One particularly brave villager, a man named Thomas, decided to take matters into his own hands. He had lost his wife and son to the darkness creeping over Stillwater, and he was determined to find out the truth. Late one night, armed with a rifle, Thomas sneaked into the Harpers' farmhouse. He crept through the silent halls until he found a hidden door leading to the basement. What he found there was beyond his worst nightmares. The basement was a shrine to death and madness. The walls were lined with photographs of the missing villagers, their faces twisted in terror. In the center of the room stood an altar, covered in dried blood and adorned with strange symbols. But it was the discovery of the Harpers' true identities that sent a chill down Thomas's spine. Hidden among the relics of horror were newspaper clippings detailing the grisly murders of a family by the name of Harper, crime that had occurred hundreds of miles away, years before. The Harpers had been murdered, their killers never found. People now living in the farmhouse weren't the Harpers at all, but the very murderers who had stolen their identities. They had moved from town to town, leaving a trail of death and despair in their wake, each time assuming the identities of their victims to start anew. As Thomas realized the horrifying truth, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see John, Mary, and Peter standing at the top of the stairs. their faces cold and devoid of humanity. John spoke in a voice that chilled Thomas to the core. "You've seen too much," he said, "and now you'll join the others." The next morning, the villagers found Thomas's house empty, belongings untouched. The Harpers were gone too, their farmhouse abandoned and lifeless. The village of Stillwater was left in a state of quiet horror, the missing never found, and the truth of what had happened only known to a few. In the years that followed, the legend of the Hollow Men spread through the region, a tale of a family that wasn't a family at all. Murderers who changed their faces like one might change clothes, moving from place to place, leaving destruction in their wake. They say that if you hear strange noises coming from the forest, or if new neighbors move in at the edge of town, you should be very, very careful. Because the Hollow Men are always looking for their next victims, always ready to assume new identities and start their deadly game all over again. And somewhere in a small, quiet village, not unlike Stillwater, the Hollow Men are already among them, their true nature hidden behind cold, lifeless eyes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again.